The Medicine District Germans from Russia Society's oral history project, Life Stories, wants to preserve the stories of Germans from Russia and Eastern Europe living in Medicine Hat and surrounding area. I am Melvin Bender. Today's interview with Elvire Necker Eberhardt is one of a series that will be videotaped. Before retirement, Elvire taught linguistics, French, and German at Laval University in Quebec City and at the Medicine Hat College. She has a PhD in philosophy. Elvire, thanks for being here. You've come a long way and accomplished a lot since your early years as a Bessarabian refugee. Tell me about the village where you were born and left at a very early age.
Well, I was born in Sofiewka, which used to be in Bessarabia, in a typical German, Protestant German village. And it was a daughter colony. My village was only 44 years old when I was born. It was founded in 1892 and was a typical German village we had a little brook in the middle, streets on each side, and then the houses all in one long row, about maybe a kilometer long. It had about 1,000 people. And it was, at the time when I was born, it belonged to Romania, although when my parents were born, it was part of the Russian Empire. Should I say something about the history, why it was like that?
Sure.
Okay. My forefathers came from southern Germany, in what was then Baden, the Black Forest. They were first in Poland, and from Poland, Tsar Alexander I called the Germans, or opened up Bessarabia to settle there. He had received this part of Europe after a war with the Turks, which he won, and the Turks, at least the Muslim Turks, fled. The Christian Turks stayed, and we had some even in our village, but the Muslim Turks, which were the majority, fled, and so he inherited a pretty empty space. So he called other people, but amongst them the Germans, and he had come across the Germans in Poland on his way to follow up with Napoleon, and so he knew that they were in dire straits and called them, and he offered them several privileges. Amongst them was that the Germans could keep their language, they could practice their religion, and they would never ever, in German that's called für ewige Zeit, and that is in all eternity, they would never have to go in the army. And so my forefathers, who had been in Poland, went on to Bessarabia. They were some of the settlers of the early villages, because in Bessarabia, the first land that they got was all one big piece, and they founded 25, what we used to call then mother colonies. But soon, or after some generations, I should say this was starting in 1815. Then, as the families grew, the farms became too small, or there wasn't enough land, so people would go outside, and the first villages were founded practically the land given to them, but later on, like my village, the land had to be bought. And as my village was so young, the actual courtyards of my village were still the original size. But in the older villages, like my husband came from one of the mother colonies, they always had divided up the farmyards and the land, and his family, for instance, which was quite wealthy, but they only had half a farmyard, whereas my parents, they still had their full farmyards. It was practically the second generation of the founders of this. village.
So where exactly in Bessarabia was your village?
This is in the practically in the middle part of Bessarabia, but in the western part.
Yes.
Nowadays, the western part and northern of Bessarabia has been put into Moldova, and the southern part were my husband's, and all the mother colonies that belongs to the Ukraine. So today, Bessarabia does not exist anymore, and I've been back 4 times since after the war, and since the 80s and 90s, and then the last time I was there in 2003. Some of the young people, they don't even know anymore that that was the original name of this piece of land.
So why did the Germans leave Sofiewka in September, October 1940?
Well, like I said, when my parents were born, this was part of Russia. The Russian Tsar had invited the Germans to come in, and everything was fine as far as the privileges were concerned, but slowly at the end of the 19th century, 1870, the privileges were taken away, and conditions became worse and more dire as far as buying land and stuff like that. So some of my relatives and forefathers emigrated already out. This is why we later on came to Medicine Hat. But then in, like I said, 1870s, that eternity was over, and the Germans had to join the Russian army. So they were in the Japanese-Russian War in 1905. They were in the First World War. But then in 1917, when the Russian Revolution started, and Russia was in such a turmoil and chaos, the Romanians and part of people in Bessarabia wanted to come to Romania. So the Romanians took over in 1918, and since then it was Romanian. But when Russia established itself and became stronger, and under Stalin especially, they never recognized that this was really a Romanian piece of land. And so in a week before the beginning of the Second World War, a treaty was made between Hitler and Stalin, or sometimes it's called between Molotov and Ribbentrop, the foreign ministers, to basically to take Bessarabia back into the then Soviet Union. But the treaty had a secret clause in it which said that the Russians were interested in Bessarabia and the Germans would, and this word I have never come across after, but in this clause it says the Germans are disinterested. There is a new word was made. I'm in linguist, or used to be in linguistics, so this was quite interesting to me. But anyway, so this was in 39, in August still 39. It was just put on paper that the Russians were still interested in Bessarabia, but the Germans were not. And in 1940, then the Russians really came to action, and they came in to Bessarabia in June, the end of June, and occupied us because that was, according to them, their land. We were then 3 months under the Russian rule, and during this time it was very hard for us in that they took everything in the stores. The German administration was deposed, and they put their own people in. For instance, in my village, they put a simple shepherd. He had been a shepherd, was not a German. He was put as the chief administrator, the mayor of the place. But of course, in reality, really the Russians ruled. They started also to incarcerate incarcerate the richer people. For instance, my grandfather was taken to prison, and I don't know what would have happened, but there was still this friendship between Russia and Germany. In the beginning, when the Russians came in June, we were not sure whether we were allowed out, as other Germans had already. The Germans from the Baltic states, Volhynia, they had already left, but we didn't know whether we could. But eventually, I think in August or something, it was allowed and settled all that we could get out too. And so we had to sign up though, or the head of a family had to sign up that he was willing. It was supposed to be on their own free will that they wanted to come out. But the way the conditions were, that, you know, economically too, it was not as good anymore, and freedom had been taken away more and more. So I don't know of anybody who didn't sign up. As a matter of fact, like in our village, we were about 1,000 people, and 30 of them were other nationalities. Some were these Turks, Christian Turks. They're called Gagauzen in that part of the world, and they wanted to get out, and we had some Bulgarian people in our village, but there had been no arrangement, so they couldn't come out. But we, before we could come out, every family had to prove 4 generations back that they were true Germans. And so the last weeks then, there was a frantic going to the pastors or the teachers to get a birth certificate of your 4 generations back. Now, some of my relatives who had been separatists, Mel might know what that is, they had left Bessarabia to other parts of Romania, and they had to go all the way there to get their birth certificates and everything. But you had to have this document, and this is so good nowadays because these documents still exist in Germany, and you can, if you are in family research, you can find all this out. I don't know. Should I say more?
How did your family travel to Germany when you were resettled?
Well, this was very well organized. We were 93,000, a few hundred Germans who wanted to come out. And I mean, that is a lot of people, 1.5 times Medicine Hat. But it was, they already had all the experience with the other Germans in Volhynia and the Baltic states. And so it was very well organized. After a while, a Russian committee came in to eat, the Russians came in June, and a German committee came in to each village, and they organized first, the women had to leave, and the men drove them to the next Danube harbor. We had to take a boat from there, but my father, who brought us there, had to return because, I mean, everything was left, so there were these animals and what have you, so they still had to look. But after 2 weeks, the men left too, and what happened then, I'm not sure. But we, women and children, we were put on a boat on the Danube and came as far as Yugoslavia. From Yugoslavia, they put us into trains, and we were put in so-called camps in Germany proper. This is now October 1940. Before we left, they had promised that each village would get a new settlement, would get farms, everybody would get farm, and they would keep us together. Now they were pretty faithful to their promise, and our village was put in 3 different camps. Our family was even in a castle. Now there's a huge castle, so about 300 people. We had a room there, and we ate all together in big halls. So there was still true, but of course, everybody thought, and farmers being active, they thought this would happen right away. But we were 1 year about in this castle, and the hardest thing for these people was that the inactivity, nothing to do. And then after this year, in Germany, which is nowadays Bavaria, we were put in a camp in Lodz, which is in Poland already, and then there we were a few months, and they told us from there we would get a farm, and that's what really happened. But it didn't happen that we were all again like in a village and stuff like that before.
So what kind of farm did you have in
Poland? Actually, I must say, what the whole time that we were in Poland, which was from March or February 1942 till January 1945, for me as a child, that is one time of fear and anxiety and scaredness. If I think of that, I just remember that I was so scared at this time. Because the way they did it, for instance with us, they took us from this camp, incidentally I should say too, it was a suburb of this Lodz, the city is called Lodz, and it had been occupied by Jews. These were Jewish cabins really, in the forest just outside of Lodz. Litzmannstadt it was called in our time. And from there, from these cabin type buildings, we were often, somehow we went into Lodz, and I remember passing something which must have been a concentration camp, because I remember these emaciated figures just standing at the barbed wire, but I was 5 at the time. But anyway, so then they brought us from this camp in Lodz to a farm by bus, and we were the last ones to get to the farm that we were supposed to get, a Polish farm. There was a Polish family on it. It was in the evening, and they said to this family, in half an hour you have to be out of here. And I remember an old lady was still peeling potatoes, she started to cry. So the whole thing was such injustice, how we got that. And then of course the way this was, and I don't know where they went, they had some kind of wagon and drove off, and then these Nazis who had accompanied us, they said, this is now yours. Well, anyway, so we were always in danger or surrounded by partisans. That's an English word too, right?
Yes.
Freedom fighters, Polish, who had hid someplace in the forest, and they would come at night. Whatever they did, like some of my relatives lost their lives from the partisans. We were never really. Nobody came to our farm, but anyway, we had a kind of an isolated farm, was a little outside of the village, and I started school there, and I had to go about 2 kilometers to the place where my school was. And not every Polish farm had been taken, so there were more Poles in this area than Germans. And of course there were children too, and I remember they would always chase me. I was the only little 6-year-old going to school, and I had to run to school and run home. Well, I was more sick than I went to school. So for me as a child, this was not a very good, and of course as for my dad, he never considered this his farm, although they said this is now your farm. My dad was still with us till November 1943, and then he had to go to the German army, and well, I didn't see him till 1947. So my mother and my grandparents, my father's parents, were with us, and they were supposed to run the farm. Well, we had Polish workers, male farmhands and female uh, ladies with us who helped us. We had an Italian person, but my mother was very well in charge. Well, I'm saying we had this farm, but you know, everything was registered. Every cow, every pig, every chicken, every goose, everything. And you were allowed so much you can, like for instance, one pig a year. The rest was, we had to bring away wherever they told us, or the eggs or whatever. So, yeah, well, we were kind of administrators, I guess, of this farm. But yeah, so we were there from 42 till 45 in January, because, you know, the Germans had then started the war with the Russians, and we knew that although officially we were winning the war. We always won the war till the last day that Hitler was alive. And my father, who was put into the German army, was not allowed to say where he was. Like, he was fighting in the east, but all we knew, he had his name and a number. I'm maybe doing too much detail, but this was very important later on for us to find each other again. So we knew my father's, okay, and had this number. And my parents had agreed on a secret code that my mom would know where he was, and we could see that he came closer and closer. And by January of 1945, I remember how our windows were and doors were rattling because the front was so close. But we were not allowed to leave because we were winning. I mean, you don't leave when you win, right? And till the last, and then in January 1945, it was very cold, probably, I've always heard say that it was -20. And by then I had a sister too, who was 15 months old. I have to say too, though, because we lived a little isolated away from the village, and that village didn't even have a school, there was no high school. I had to go to another village, but it was only up to grade 4, I think. So my brothers, or my oldest brother, was sent to my other grandparents who lived in a bigger place in Poland, and he went to school there. My younger brother was 10 years old, and I was 8 by then. And then my sister was 15 months old. When finally, in January, and you could hear already the war, or the front anyway, we were allowed to go. And there were Nazi older men who, I don't know what function they had, but they would come, I remember, at night, and they said, okay, tomorrow you can go. So it was so much snow, I remember we had to shovel our way free to get out from our farm, and then we accumulated others who had started fleeing in a certain place, and we knew the person who was supposed to organize this trek. And he said, well, don't go with a 15-month-old baby in -20-degree weather. Take the train. This was a place where they organized all this. There was a station, and he said, we are expecting another train. Okay, so this was a decision of a minute for my mother. She said, okay, then my brother, 10-year-old brother, and one of the Polish farmhands, you go on with the trek, and we'll take the train. And they said, oh yeah, in the next province, which was Pomerania, you'll meet there again. I mean, you don't think in a situation like that. There were 10 million people on the road, like coming from the east into the, we didn't know nothing. So anyway, my mother grabbed something with one hand and something with the other hand. We had the baby carriage of my sister, my grandparents, my mother, my sister and I, what we had on, that's how we left there. And my brother went on with the farmhand and the horses and the wagon. lucky an hour, the last train came. I mean, we could have been left there, but a train came. It was so full. I remember we were in freight cars, and you were just, one person beside the other. You couldn't fall over. So, but my oldest brother was still with my grandparents, hopefully, we didn't know. And my younger brother went on with the horses and wagon, with the trek. We took the train. For us, it took about 3 weeks, and we didn't know where to go. We just wanted to get away from the Russians, and we ended up in Denmark. The 5 of us, my grandparents and we 3. My younger brother ended up in what was later on East Germany in the north, and my other grandparents and my older brother, they ended up in the south of East Germany. And my father, when the war was over, he was in Czechoslovakia.
Do you remember the ship that you were on when you went to Copenhagen?
No, we went by train. We were always in the train, like we went
Okay.
across North Germany and then Schleswig-Holstein and up into Denmark. We were one of the earliest ones who came. In the end, Denmark at that time had only 6 million, and 250,000 Germans had come in, and a lot came by boat, but we didn't. We came by train, and it was, like I said, we were some of the earliest ones, so there were very few, and German Danes who just lived north of the border, they took in us, and I mean, we weren't alone, the whole train, or several trains probably, but again, they didn't want to take 5 people, so my grandparents came to a family, my mother and my sister, and I was alone in another family. So by that time then, my immediate family was 6 people, were in 5 different places. Anyway, but this was then in February about when we were in Germany, and we kept, nobody knew where the other one was, but we kept writing to my father. And as my father had just his name and the number, we always wrote just that on the letter. And lucky for him, he kept his number, because as many soldiers lost their lives, they used to fill up units and then you changed your number. But my father kept his number, and he got some of our letters. So he, in Czechoslovakia, somehow, how that worked, I don't know, he knew where each one of us was, whereas we didn't know where the others were. And then when the war ended, he ended actually, my father, and like I said, was in Czechoslovakia, that's where the Russians were. And most German men were taken prisoner of war, for instance, my husband, but my dad was not. They said, go home. Hitler is dead, go home. And so he tried to get us. And the first thing was he wanted to get to Denmark, then at the end of the war, which then was May 1945. But the Danes had completely closed the borders, and he could not get in. So then he got my 2 brothers, and it's a long story, but in the end he found a place in southern Germany where my forefathers, I mean not exactly, but this area where my forefathers had come from, and he lived there. And for us, we couldn't get out of Denmark, although you needed permission from, my father was in the American zone, Germany was divided up in the 4 zones, and he had to have a permission from the Americans that he could bring in the rest of his family. That took a while. But anyway, then by July 1947, we also could leave Denmark, and then we were united.
So what kind of jobs, schooling did your family have in Germany?
Well, I was the most fortunate because I was young, and my sister too. My brothers had lost quite a bit of school, and my oldest brother wanted to become a forest ranger. But I mean, Germany was so in ruins and destroyed, and so many refugees from the east coming in. There wasn't a chance that he could get that. So he started a gardening training that was supposed to help him, but when he was done, there was no opening for him. So he immigrated into Canada in 1952, and my younger brother in 54 wanted to join him, so they left for that. But I and my younger brother took the training of a carpenter, but I was just at the right time, although like I said, I was so much sick in Poland because of the conditions there. I couldn't read. I was in my starting grade 2 and I couldn't read. I mean, that is terrible. And of course there were many refugee children like that in 1947 when we finally came. And they took, how should I say, they helped us a lot. So I was accepted into high school, which I should have had after 4 years of really schooling, which I didn't have. But I mean, they helped us a lot. And so I went through normal high school, which is in Germany 13 years. And then after that I took a teacher's training course or program. Those days, I was done in 1958, they were so short of teachers. I mean, many men were still prisoners of war or were killed in the war, that, for instance, when I started out, I had a grade 1 class with 54 students. That is impossible to think. And they drove us through this program in 2 years. We didn't have, 4 weeks, we had holidays in the whole year. And okay, so then I was a teacher. So I had that training, and my father was just a laborer, but I mean, we didn't have anything in Germany. So this was very cheap, and scholarships and everything. So I could become a teacher. But that was pretty well all I could have done in Germany as an elementary teacher with this, government-sponsored program. No, there wasn't more, but I had that.
So where did your brothers Gerhard and Albert live in Canada at this time?
Oh yeah, we had relatives in Walsh.
In Walsh?
Walsh and in Medicine Hat. Some of those earlier, when they started conscripting men in Bessarabia, and that privilege that you didn't have to go to war was lifted, then many Germans left either to South America, Brazil, or to the Caucasian mountains too, and to Canada a lot. Like my relatives who had left before the First World War, and we knew about that. I want to say this. I remember my grandmother getting letters from Medicine Hat, and her brother was here it was called Wisdom, which is and it always said on the letters Wisdom. But I remember when he wrote, there was always some problem. Like either they didn't have moisture in the spring that the seeds would germinate, or they had hail, or they had snow. And my grandmother, I remember, she used to say, I don't know what kind of country is that they ended up with. But my brothers, knew this address, and that's where they went.
What were the family names of your relatives?
Heller, one was, and in Walsh they're Jans.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when did your parents?
Yeah. Well, then
come?
my brothers were here, and they had left when they were in their early 20s. So they found wives here, and they had a child, and we wanted to visit them. But by then, my father had already bought part of a house, and we thought, well, when you visit, you should stay maybe a month or so. Well, what do we do with this thing? you know, those rooms that we have there. So we said, let's sell it all and leave too. And that's how it happened, and we followed my brothers who were here.
And you arrived in Medicine Hat?
Yeah,
and
1960.
bought
We came, and I must say this is the best country, because here then I had a chance to, oh well, actually, before I could go back to university here, I was working in the Royal Bank downtown because, I mean, my papers were all in German, of course, that had to be translated, but they were still looking for teachers, and I was working at, like I said, at the Royal Bank, and the superintendent of the country school, Mr. Mackay was his name, I think.
Yes.
He came to I lived with my brother, and my parents lived with my other brother, came to my house and asked me if I wouldn't be a teacher in Schule. I mean, nowadays that is totally different, right? And anyway, slowly my papers were translated, and somehow he had found out that I was a teacher from Germany, and I was teaching in Schule, but I tell you, there were more than one occasions when my students would say, Miss Eberhardt, we say it so and so, and then I knew I had made a mistake in English. Yeah.
So where did you get your university training then?
Well, then I saved already some money when I was working at the bank. Actually, I could save I got $150 at the Royal Bank. I had to give $30 to my brother for board and room, $20, well, some of it was through taxes and I don't know, but a little bit I had in pocket money, but $100 I saved every month to go back to university. And so I had about $1,200 after a year in the bank. And when I was teaching in Schule, I got $250 a month. Well, there, lived in a teacherage with an outhouse and all that. But the kids were so good to me. Anyway, I saved every penny. And I went to summer school at first, and then I saw that you could do that here in this country. You know, and those days in Edmonton, a whole Calgary University didn't exist yet when I came in the 60s, early 60s. But a whole year, not even just a semester, was $300 tuition fee. I mean, this country was so good to us, or to me.
You've taken a number of trips back to Bessarabia.
Yeah.
What is the village like that you came from?
My village actually has kept its name. Many villages have changed their names. For my husband's village, for instance, I was back in '86 alone, and then with my husband I was in '91, '96 and 2003. And I must say, each time it was rather worse than better. The first few times there were still Germans living in Bessarabia, because we all had left, but from other parts of the Soviet Union they had resettled some in our village, and there were still some, but the last time when we were there were no Germans there anymore. And it was bad. Like, I think the houses where my husband comes from, because it was an older village, maybe were older, but 2003 when we were there, quite a few houses were just ruins. And then there was a situation like that. Then there was a house where you could see somebody lived, and again, well, there were some new houses too, and in my village, for instance, the roads were so bad. And they had a pile of sand lying there, a pile of stones. And I said to my husband, why don't they take a rake and fill the holes up with the sand or the stones, and have decent roads? But he always said, you don't know the communistic system. So nobody did that. For years it was lying there.
So did the original prayer chapel still stand? Did you find that?
Yes, yeah. We had only a prayer chapel, we didn't have a church, and it was used as a school during the week, and this was now just a school. We had a little tower beside it for the bells that had been taken away, but the school was, and the first time especially when I came, 86, my grandparents' house were still there. Ours was not, because like I said, we were a fairly new village and our farm yards were fairly big. For them that was too big, so where our house was there were 3 farms, but they had put 4 houses there that I guess made everything a little closer. Yeah, but I must say each time it was worse. In our neighbor village where our pastor was, the Germans who now live in Germany, they had restored that church. And in 2003, when we were there, they actually rededicated it, but to the Orthodox Church. And so that looked very nice. Our school, like the prayer house, they had divided it up in classrooms. Looked fairly okay too.
Now you're writing about your late husband, Elvire Necker, who was born in Kulm.
Cool, yeah.
Tell me about his war years.
Well, he was, like we, was resettled in Poland, but then when he was 19, I guess, he was conscripted into the German army. And at the end of the war, he was in close to Gdansk, by the Baltic Sea, and his whole unit was taken as prisoner of war into Germany. And he didn't come out till almost 5 years later. He was in different camps in what is now White Russia. Dnipropetrovsk was one, I remember, close to Minsk he was in at one time. And he had terrible conditions. Luckily for him, because, like we lived in Romania, but there at one time was Russian. So they had Russian workers, Romanian work. Well, his school was a Romanian school already. So he had learned Romanian in school, Russians from their workers, and he could speak German, Russian and Romanian. And so when he was put in these prisoner of war camps in Russia, well, there were Romanians in it too, because the Romanians went over to the Russians, right? And in his camp were Russians, Romanians, and then the Germans and they didn't understand each other. So he was used as a translator, and also pretty soon he somehow had something to do with the kitchen. So he survived, because the way he talked, at least half of them must have just died of hunger in these camps.
So when was he able to reach Germany?
In December 1949 came out.
Now, your PhD dissertation was called The Bessarabian German Dialect of Medicine Hat, Alberta.
Yes.
What did you learn about the Bessarabian German dialect?
Well, I wrote a grammar of my dialect.
Yes.
Because, well, you probably know that what we call High German, the official German language, now many people speak it, but that is really an artificial language. Originally, Germany were about 300 different independent states, and even each little region had their own dialect, and that was the language that they used. But then when Luther came around and the Bible, we got a language that now people speak that as their mother tongue. But most people always speak a dialect, and you learn the official High German, what we call, in school. And with my dissertation, where I wrote a grammar for my dialect, and I also wrote something like a dictionary with our words, and I could find out exactly, sometimes to the village even, where my people had come from in Germany, because they would use a certain expression for a certain utensil, or for instance the cock, what is it called in English? The rooster has different names in Germany, and the one we used then was used in a certain area in southern Germany. And this way I could find out where they actually came from, as far as the German was concerned, but but some of the Bessarabian German vocabulary also has Polish names or Russian words in it, or North German, because some came from North Germany. Yeah.
Do you still hear the Bessarabian German dialect in Medicine these days?
Yeah, the ones I know, and yeah. Mm.
You've brought along an artifact.
Oh yeah. You know, like it was in earlier days here in Canada too, I'm sure, you were self-sufficient. You did everything, right? Well, you lived off the farm, you had your sheep, you were spinning and whatever you have to do, carding the wool, and they would weave blankets like this. But I find it so interesting because it was not really used as a blanket, they used it as a baby, means to carry a baby. And I think this is so neat, like they would use it. Can I stand up?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then they put the baby here, it was tucked under. It was quite an art. I had to ask a lady in Calgary to show me. And then they tucked the other one, and they would carry their baby around that way when they worked or when they went someplace. I have actually never seen a baby carriage in a museum. In probably they didn't have a baby carriage. They were always carrying their babies around in these blankets, I guess. Nowadays, of course, in Fargo, or even Bismarck, they're trying to get you to donate. I've donated stuff, but this I have kept.
Is there anything you'd like to add while we're doing this interview?
Well, I want to say, because I'm a Christian, that it is a miracle that we survived all this ordeal, because 3 of my cousins who were as old as my sister died on account of the cold and had no food and stuff, or that my husband survived his time in the prisoner of war camp. That is a miracle. Or that my father kept his number. You can't take that just as, just happening. Or that he wasn't, nobody I've talked to or I know, when they, at the end of the war, when they were at the Russian side, were not taken prisoner of war. My husband spent almost 5 years in Russia because he was a German soldier, and the Russians were there where he was. So, but my father wasn't. These Russians were playing cards, he told us, and they didn't want to be bothered. And they said, go home, Hitler's dead. So that we survived all this and that we would find each other again. I must say too, we in Denmark, we ate a lot of fish. If I remember, the food was always fish, but nonetheless we had enough to eat. The bread often was so wet that you could, if you pressed it out, you had liquid coming out, but we had enough to eat. Whereas my father, who, he lived in Germany then after the war, and one time he told us they would get in a school, they would get a ration every day, and he said they got a slice of bread, and if you held it at one side it would fall over because it was so thin, and there was nothing to eat and stuff like that. So Or my brother with 10-year-old with our farmhand. You know, he ended up in northern Germany, northern East Germany, and for a while he didn't have any parents. So lucky for him, he ended up on a farm where there was a couple who didn't have any children, and they wanted to adopt him. But our farmhand, who had come to that place still, he, when the war was over, he wanted to go home, and he said, well, you don't have any parents, you better come with me. But this farm couple said, no, he's going to stay, he'll be our child. So till my, I mean, there were so many, or we had nothing, just our clothes that we survived. But every once in a while, Red Cross ladies would give you a sandwich, and yeah, we had nothing. I mean, just for these 3 weeks on the flight, how did we survive? But I remember one time we found a canteen, you know, that like a bottle that like the soldiers have, and it was my job as an 8-year-old, when the train was stopping, I had to go and find some water. And then we had this water. I mean, how long did that last, right? Yeah, there's so many, for me, they're miracles of God that happened. And then, of course, we could come to Canada to this, and I could go to university. That would have never happened in Germany. I have a house, every one of us has a house now. How could that be if we had stayed there? So I just thank God that the way He has led us, it was just marvelous.
Well, thanks again for allowing us to interview you.
Well, thank you. If that's interesting to you.